The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War and marked a significant turning point in the conflict. Located in southern Pennsylvania, Gettysburg became the site of the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. The battle pitted General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia against the Union's Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George G. Meade. The stakes were incredibly high, as Lee hoped that a Confederate victory on Northern soil might force the Union to negotiate peace or even encourage foreign intervention. However, by the end of the three-day battle, it was clear that the Union had achieved a decisive victory, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both sides. The lead-up to Gettysburg began in June 1863 when Lee launched his second invasion of the North. After his successful victories in Virginia, including the stunning Confederate win at Chancellorsville, Lee believed that taking the fight to the Union territory could relieve pressure on the South and give his army access to fresh supplies. Lee also hoped that a Confederate victory on the Northern soil might weaken Northern morale and strengthen calls for peace within the Union. Lee's army crossed into Pennsylvania in late June, pushing northward as Union forces scrambled to intercept them. The two armies finally met in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where the stage was set for one of the most important battles of the war. The battle began on July 1st, 1863, when Confederate forces under General A.P. Hill clashed with Union cavalry led by General John Buford just outside of Gettysburg. Buford's troops, though outnumbered, held off the Confederate advance long enough for Union reinforcements to arrive, and by the end of the first day, both sides had gathered significant forces. The Confederates pushed Union forces back through the town of Gettysburg, but the Union Army regrouped on strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. On the second day of the battle, July 2nd, Lee attempted to break the Union line by launching assaults on both the Union left and right flanks. Fierce fighting took place in locations that would become infamous, including Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and the Little Round Top. Union forces under commanders such as General Winfield Scott Hancock and Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain fought valiantly to hold their positions. Despite heavy Confederate attacks, the Union line held firm, and by the end of the second day, Lee's plan to turn the Union flanks had failed. With his earlier assaults repelled, Lee made the fateful decision to launch a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line on the third day of the battle. This assault, known as Pickett's Charge, became one of the most famous and disastrous events of the entire Civil War. On July 3rd, after a massive artillery bombardment that was intended to soften the Union defenses, Lee ordered General George Pickett and approximately 12,000 Confederate soldiers to charge across an open field and attack the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederates advanced bravely, but they faced withering fire from Union artillery and infantry. As the Confederates crossed the open ground, they were decimated by cannon fire and musket volleys, with an entire ranks of men falling in the onslaught. Despite their bravery, the Confederate soldiers were unable to break through the Union line. Pickett's charge ended in failure, with heavy Confederate losses. Of the 12,000 men who participated in the charge, more than half were killed, wounded, or captured. Pickett's charge marked the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, and it was a devastating blow to Lee's army. Lee, realizing that his army had been beaten, retreated back to Virginia on July 4, 1863, the same day that the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg fell to Union forces in the Western Theater. The Battle of Gettysburg was a decisive Union victory, but it came at a tremendous cost. The battle resulted in approximately 51,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing soldiers from both sides. It was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and the high casualty figures stunned the nation. For the Confederacy, Gettysburg was a disaster. Lee's army, which had been seen as nearly invincible after a string of victories in the Eastern Theater, was forced to retreat back into the South, marking the end of Lee's invasion of the North. The defeat at Gettysburg dealt a severe blow to the Confederate morale and weakened the Southern war effort. For the Union, the victory at Gettysburg was a much-needed boost. After suffering numerous defeats in the Eastern Theater, the Union Army had finally won a decisive victory over Lee's forces. The success at Gettysburg, coupled with the victory at Vicksburg, marked a turning point in the war. The twin victories gave the Union momentum and put the Confederacy on the defensive for the remainder of the conflict. In addition to its military significance, the Battle of Gettysburg would come to be remembered for one of the most famous speeches in American history, the Gettysburg Address. On November 19, 1863, just a few months after the battle, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the soldiers who had died in the battle. Lincoln's speech, delivered in just over 2 minutes, had become one of the most iconic speeches in American history. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln framed the war as a struggle not just for the preservation of the Union, but for the principles of liberty and equality upon which the nation was founded. He famously stated that the United States was founded on the idea that all men are created equal, and he argued that the war was a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty could endure. Lincoln honored the soldiers who had fought and died at Gettysburg, calling on the living to dedicate themselves to the unfinished work of ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address was significant not only for its eloquence, but also the way it was reshaped the meaning of the war. Lincoln's speech transformed the conflict from a fight merely to reunite the country into a struggle for a birth of freedom, one that would bring an end to slavery and ensure that the United States lived up to its founding ideals. The speech also reinforced the Union's resolve to continue the fight, even in the face of heavy casualties that had been suffered at Gettysburg and elsewhere. The Gettysburg Address remains one of the most powerful expressions of American ideals and continues to be studied and revered today. The psychological impact of Gettysburg on the Confederate Army was profound. For Robert E. Lee, Gettysburg was the first major defeat of his career as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee had built his reputation on bold and aggressive tactics, and his successes at battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville had given the Confederacy hope that it could win the war. However, the defeat at Gettysburg shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Lee and his army. The Confederate losses at Gettysburg were staggering, and many of Lee's best officers and men were killed or wounded in the battle. The failure of Pickett's charge, in particular, weighed heavily on Lee, who took personal responsibility for the defeat. Lee's army never fully recovered from the losses it suffered at Gettysburg. Although the Confederacy would continue to fight for nearly 2 more years, the defeat at Gettysburg marked the beginning of the end for the Southern war effort. Lee's army would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war, and it would never again be able to mount a major invasion of the North. For the Confederate soldiers who survived Gettysburg, the defeat was a devastating blow to their morale. Many Confederate soldiers had believed that they were on the verge of victory, and the loss at Gettysburg dashed these hopes. As Lee's army retreated back into Virginia, it became clear that the Confederacy was fighting a losing battle. The psychological toll of the defeat, combined with the growing shortages of supplies and manpower in the South, made it increasingly difficult for the Confederate Army to sustain the war effort. The aftermath of Gettysburg also had significant implications for the overall course of the war. While the Union had achieved a great victory, General Meade faced criticism for not pursuing Lee's army more aggressively during its retreat. Some in the Union high command believed that Meade had missed an opportunity to destroy Lee's army completely, which could have brought the war to a swift conclusion. Despite this criticism, Gettysburg was still a turning point in the war. The Union now had the upper hand, and the Confederacy was on the defensive in both the Eastern and Western theaters. The victory at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, coming just 1 day apart, gave the Union the momentum it needed to press forward and eventually achieve victory. The Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's charge, and the Gettysburg Address remain a defining moment in American history. The battle was a critical turning point in the Civil War, and its outcome helped set the stage for the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address not only honored the sacrifices of those who fought and died at Gettysburg, but also redefined the meaning of the war, emphasizing the importance of liberty, equality, and democracy. The psychological impact of Gettysburg on the Confederate Army, combined with the Union's growing strength, signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Although the war would continue for nearly 2 more years, the defeat at Gettysburg marked the turning of the tide. For the Union, Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address symbolized the hope of a united nation and a future free from the stain of slavery. For the Confederacy, it was a bitter realization, and their aspirations for independence were slipping away. The psychological impact of the Confederate Army extended beyond the battlefield. Morale in the South began to falter as soldiers and civilians alike faced the grim reality that victory may no longer be attainable. The heavy casualties at Gettysburg, combined with the simultaneous loss at Vicksburg, left the Confederacy reeling. Many soldiers who believed in their cause and in the invincibility of their leaders, especially Robert E. Lee, began to question whether the war could still be won. While Lee remained a respected and beloved leader among his men, the defeat at Gettysburg cast a long shadow over his command. The psychological toll was not only felt by the Confederate Army, but also in the homes and communities of the South. News of the defeat spread quickly, and the realization that the tide of the war had shifted in favor of the Union was difficult for many in the Confederacy to accept. The loss of so many men at Gettysburg, particularly during Pickett's charge, left families grieving and communities struggling to cope with the human cost of the war. As the Confederacy faced mounting challenges including shortages of food, supplies, and manpower, the defeat at Gettysburg made it clear that the Southern war effort was in jeopardy. The battle also had lasting effects on the political landscape for the Confederacy. While the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, continued to insist that the South could achieve victory, there were increasingly calls for peace within the Southern states. Some Confederate politicians and citizens began to argue that it was time to seek a negotiated settlement with the Union, though Davis and other hardliners rejected the notion of surrender. In the North, the victory at Gettysburg bolstered support for the Union war effort and President Abraham Lincoln's leadership. The battle, along with the Gettysburg Address, helped to galvanize Northern resolve to see the war through to its conclusion. Lincoln's speech not only honored the fallen, but also reaffirmed the Union's commitment to the principles of democracy and equality. The Gettysburg Address gave the Union cause new meaning, casting the war as a fight not just for national unity, but for the very ideas upon which the United States had been founded. As the Union Army regrouped and prepared for future campaigns, the momentum gained at Gettysburg would carry them through the final years of the war. The victory at Gettysburg, combined with the leadership of Ulysses S. Grant, who was soon promoted to command all Union armies, allowed the North to continue pressing the Confederacy on multiple fronts. The Union's coordinated strategy, with Grant leading the effort in the Eastern Theater and General William Sherman conducting his devastating campaigns in the Western Theater, further weakened the Confederate war effort. The aftermath of Gettysburg and its psychological impact on the Confederate Army were felt in every subsequent battle. No longer able to mount large-scale offensives in the North, Lee's army was forced into a defensive posture, trying to hold off Union advances. The loss of men, resources, and morale at Gettysburg left the Confederacy struggling to recover. Over the next 2 years, the Union's relentless pressure, combined with their strategic advances gained at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, would eventually lead to the collapse of the Confederate war effort. By April 1865, after a series of increasingly desperate battles and sieges, Lee would surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg, therefore, stands as one of the most significant moments in American history. It was a battle that marked the turning point of the Civil War, a victory that gave the Union the upper hand, and then a defeat that signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. It was also a battle that left a profound psychological impact on both sides, one that tested the resolve of the Confederate Army and inspired the Union to continue its fight for a nation united under the principles of liberty and equality. The legacy of Gettysburg, along with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, continues to resonate in American memory, symbolizing both the cost of the Civil War and the enduring values that the nation sought to uphold. In 1864, the Union leadership under President Abraham Lincoln recognized that to win the Civil War, they would need a more aggressive and coordinated strategy across multiple theaters of war. This led to the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Grant, having achieved significant victories in the Western Theater, brought with him a new vision of how to prosecute the war. His approach would become known as the Overland Campaign, a series of relentless and bloody battles aimed at wearing down Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. The Overland Campaign began in May 1864 with the Battle of the Wilderness. The Wilderness, located in Northern Virginia, was a dense, tangled forest that provided little room for maneuvering large armies. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and often hand-to-hand, with visibility obscured by thick underbrush and smoke from firing of rifles and artillery. Despite suffering heavy casualties, Grant refused to retreat, a stark contrast to previous Union generals who had often fallen back after sustaining losses. His strategy was one of attrition. He knew that the Union's superior numbers and resources would eventually overpower the Confederates if they continued to engage Lee's army. After the bloody stalemate in the Wilderness, Grant pressed on Spotsylvania Courthouse, where another series of intense battles took place. The fighting at Spotsylvania was characterized by trench warfare, with both sides digging in and constructing defensive positions. One of the most famous engagements at Spotsylvania was the fighting at the Bloody Angle, where Union forces attempted to break through the Confederate lines. The combat at the Bloody Angle was some of the fiercest of the entire war, with soldiers fighting in close quarters for hours on end. Once again, Grant's forces sustained heavy casualties, but his determination to continue the fight remained unwavering. As the Overland Campaign progressed, Grant's next major engagement was at Cold Harbor in early June 1864. At Cold Harbor, Grant made the fateful decision to launch a frontal assault on entrenched Confederate positions. The result was catastrophic for the Union. In just a few hours, thousands of Union soldiers were killed or wounded as they charged directly into Confederate gunfire. The battle was a disaster for Grant, and many soldiers pinned slips of paper with their names on their uniforms so their bodies could be identified after the inevitable slaughter. Despite the heavy losses at Cold Harbor, Grant's campaign continued to grind down Lee's army. The Overland Campaign, though costly in terms of lives, succeeded in its ultimate goal, keeping pressure on Lee and gradually depleting the Confederate Army's ability to resist. Grant's strategy was to prevent Lee from regrouping or launching counterattacks, ensuring that the Confederates would be on the defensive for the remainder of the war. While Grant was engaging Lee in the Eastern Theater, General William Sherman was leading a campaign in Western Theater that would become one of the most famous and controversial of the Civil War. Sherman's Atlanta campaign began in May 1864 and was aimed at capturing the city of Atlanta, Georgia, a vital Confederate transportation hub and industrial center. Sherman's strategy involved maneuvering his forces around the Confederate Army under General Joseph E. Johnston, attempting to outflank them and force a retreat. Over the course of several months, Sherman's forces engaged in a series of battles and skirmishes as they slowly advanced towards Atlanta. The campaign was marked by Sherman's use of what would later be termed maneuver warfare, where he sought to avoid costly frontal assaults in favor of cutting off the Confederate supply lines and forcing them to abandon their positions. By July 1864, Sherman's forces had reached the outskirts of Atlanta. The Confederate leadership, alarmed by Sherman's advance, replaced Johnson with General Bell Hood, who was known for his aggressive tactics. Hood launched several attacks against Sherman's forces in an attempt to drive them back, but these attacks failed, resulting in a heavy Confederate casualty. On September 2, 1864, Sherman's forces captured Atlanta, delivering a devastating blow to the Confederacy. The fall of Atlanta was a major Union victory and had significant political ramifications. It boosted Northern morale and helped secure Abraham Lincoln's re-election in November 1864, as it demonstrated that the war was progressing in the Union's favor. Following the capture of Atlanta, Sherman embarked on his infamous March to the Sea. Sherman's march, which began in November 1864, involved moving his army from Atlanta to the coastal city of Savannah, Georgia, cutting a swath through the heart of the Confederacy. During the march, Sherman employed a strategy of total war, a concept that aimed to break the Confederacy's ability to continue fighting by targeting not only military forces but also civilian infrastructure. As Sherman's troops marched through Georgia, they destroyed railroads, factories, farms, and other resources that could support the Confederate war effort. Sherman's intention was to break the will of the Southern population, making it impossible for them to sustain the war. The destruction wrought by Sherman's forces was immense, and it left a lasting impact on the Southern states. By the time Sherman reached Savannah in December 1864, his campaign had effectively crippled the Confederacy's ability to resist. The March to the Sea is often seen as one of the first instances of modern warfare where the distinction between military and civilian targets was blurred in the name of achieving a decisive victory. The Civil War, particularly in its later years, introduced the concept of total war, a strategy in which the complete mobilization of a society's resources and population for war was necessary to achieve victory. Grant and Sherman in particular embraced this concept, recognizing that the South's ability to continue the war depended not only on its military forces but also on its civilian population and infrastructure. Total war meant the Union forces would target anything that could aid the Confederate war, including transportation networks, agricultural production, and industry. This was most evident in Sherman's March to the Sea, where his forces systematically destroyed Southern infrastructure, leaving a path of ruin in their wake. The effects of total war on the Southern population were profound. Many civilians, particularly in Georgia and the Carolinas, lost their homes, their crops, and livelihoods as Union soldiers burned farms, tore up railroads, and destroyed factories. The destruction caused by Sherman's forces not only disrupted the Confederate war effort, but also left deep scars on the Southern economy and society. Southern civilians who had already endured years of hardship due to the war now faced even more severe shortages of food, shelter, and basic necessities. The psychological impact of total war on the Southern population was significant as well. Many Southerners, particularly in the areas directly affected by Sherman's campaign, became demoralized and disillusioned with the Confederate cause. The war, which had once been seen as a noble struggle for independence, increasingly appeared hopeless as Union forces moved through the South with little opposition. Sherman's strategy of total war, though controversial, was ultimately effective in hastening the end of the conflict. By destroying the South's capacity to continue fighting, Sherman helped bring the end to the Civil War and laid the groundwork of the Union's victory in 1865. While Sherman was conducting his campaign in Georgia, another Union general, Philip Sheridan, was leading a devastating campaign in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley, often referred to as the breadbasket of the Confederacy, was a critical source of food and supplies for the Confederate Army. Throughout the war, the valley had been a key strategic region with both Union and Confederate forces vying for control over its rich agricultural resources. By 1864, the Union High Command recognized that to weaken the Confederate war effort, they needed to destroy the resources provided by the Shenandoah Valley. Sheridan's Shenandoah Valley campaign, which began in the summer of 1864, was part of Grant's overall strategy of applying pressure on multiple fronts. Sheridan, a trusted subordinate of Grant, was given the task of clearing Confederate forces from the valley and destroying anything that could be of value to the Confederacy. In a series of battles, including the Battle of 3rd Winchester and the Battle of Cedar Creek, Sheridan's forces defeated Confederate General Jubal Early's army and secured control of the valley. Once the Confederate forces were driven out, Sheridan turned the task of systematically destroying the valley's resources. His troops burned crops, barns, and mills, leaving the once fertile region a wasteland. This destruction, known as the Burning, was intended to deprive the Confederate Army of food and supplies and send a clear message that the Union was determined to bring the war to an end. Like Sherman's March to the Sea, Sheridan's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley was an example of total war in practice. The destruction of the Shenandoah Valley had a profound impact on the Confederacy's ability to continue the war. Without the agricultural resources of the valley, Confederate forces faced even greater shortages of food and supplies. Sheridan's success in the Shenandoah Valley also boosted the Union morale and helped secure Lincoln's re-election in 1864. The campaigns of 1864, led by generals like Ulysses S. Grant, William Sherman, and Philip Sheridan, marked a turning point in the Civil War. Through a combination of relentless military pressures and the adoption of total war tactics, the Union was able to weaken the Confederacy's ability to wage war and break the will of the Southern population. Grant's overland campaign, though costly, succeeded in grinding down Lee's forces, while Sherman's capturing of Atlanta and his march to the sea crippled the Confederates' war effort in the West. Sheridan's destruction of Shenandoah Valley further deprived of the Confederacy vital resources. By the end of 1864, the Confederacy was on the brink of collapse, and the Union's victory was within reach. The concept of total war not only helped bring about the end of the Civil War, but also left a lasting impact on the way wars would be fought in the future. By 1865, the American Civil War had entered its final and most decisive phase. Union forces under the leadership of General Ulysses S. Grant had worn down the Confederate armies through relentless campaigns, particularly in the Eastern Theater. One of the most critical aspects of the Union strategy was the Siege of Petersburg, a prolonged campaign that ultimately led to the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital. The Siege of Petersburg began in June 1864 and lasted for nearly 10 months, making it one of the longest military engagements of the war. Located just south of Richmond, Petersburg was a vital supply center for the Confederate capital. Grant knew that capturing Petersburg would cut off Richmond from crucial supplies, forcing the Confederacy into an unsustainable position. However, instead of launching a direct assault on the well-fortified city, Grant opted for a siege, encircling the city and cutting off its supply lines. Both armies dug in, constructing trenches that stretched for miles, foreshadowing the trench warfare that would later become common during World War I. The siege was marked by a series of brutal battles and skirmishes as Union forces attempted to extend their lines and tighten the noose around Petersburg. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, knew that holding Petersburg and Richmond was critical to the survival of the Confederacy. But as the months dragged on, Lee's forces became increasingly stretched thin. Confederate resources were depleted, and Lee's army was suffering from desertions, shortages of supplies, and low morale. In March 1865, Grant launched a final series of offensives, including the Battle of Fort Stedman, a failed Confederate attempt to break through the Union lines. This marked the beginning of the end for Lee's army, as Grant continued to push forward. By early April, Union forces succeeded in breaking through the Confederate defenses at Petersburg. On April 2, 1865, Lee informed Confederate President Jefferson Davis that Richmond could no longer be defended, and Davis and his government fled the capital. Union troops entered Richmond on April 3, 1865, marking the fall of the Confederate capital. The capture of Richmond was a symbolic and strategic victory for the Union, signaling the collapse of the Confederate government. Lee's army, now in full retreat, was all that stood between the Union and total victory. After the fall of Richmond, Lee's remaining forces attempted to escape to the west in hopes of linking up with their Confederate armies. However, the Union Army pursued Lee relentlessly, preventing him from regrouping or reaching safety. Lee's army, weakened by months of fighting and lacking adequate food and supplies, was on the brink of collapse. Grant's forces, moving quickly, cut off Lee's retreat at a small village of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. On April 9, 1865, surrounded and outnumbered, Lee recognized that further resistance was futile. Rather than subject his men to unnecessary bloodshed, Lee made the difficult decision to surrender his army to Grant. The surrender at Appomattox Courthouse effectively marked the end of the Civil War in the Eastern Theater. The meeting between Grant and Lee took place in the home of Wilmer McLean, a simple farmhouse that would soon forever be associated with one of the most significant moments in American history. The terms of surrender were generous. Grant allowed Lee's men to return home with their horses and personal belongings, and he ensured that none of them would be prosecuted for treason. Grant's goal was to promote reconciliation and healing rather than punishment, recognizing that the nation needed to reunite after 4 years of devastating conflict. Lee's surrender was a moment of profound emotion for both sides. Many Confederate soldiers wept as they laid down their arms, while Union soldiers showed respect for their defeated adversaries. The surrender at Appomattox did not end the war immediately, as there were still Confederate forces fighting in other parts of the South. However, it marked the beginning of the end. Lee's surrender was followed by the surrender of other Confederate armies in the weeks that followed, signaling the disintegration of the Confederate war effort. Although the surrender at Appomattox is often seen as the symbolic end of the Civil War, fighting continued for a short time in other parts of the South. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who commanded Confederate forces in North Carolina, initially attempted to continue the fight after hearing of Lee's surrender. However, with no realistic chance of victory, Johnston eventually surrendered to the Union General William Sherman on April 26, 1865, at Bennett Place in North Carolina. This surrender marked the capitulation of the largest remaining Confederate army. In Alabama, Confederate General Richard Taylor surrendered his forces to Union General Edward Canby in early May. And in early June, Confederate General Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader, became the last Confederate general to surrender his forces. The Confederate government, which had fled Richmond in April, attempted to regroup in the South. Jefferson Davis, still hoping to continue the fight, traveled southward with members of his cabinet, hoping to reach Texas and continue the war from there. However, Davis was captured by Union cavalry in Georgia on May 10, 1865, effectively ending any remaining hopes for a Confederate resurgence. As the remaining Confederate armies surrendered and Davis was captured, the Confederate war effort collapsed completely. The war that had divided the nation and claimed the lives of more than 600,000 soldiers was finally drawing to a close. The final battles and skirmishes of the Civil War, while smaller in scale compared to the earlier engagements, were still marked by moments of intense fighting and loss. For many Confederate soldiers, the end of the war brought feelings of despair and uncertainty about what the future would hold. For Union soldiers, their final victories were a culmination of years of sacrifice and perseverance. As Confederate forces laid down their arms, the long process of rebuilding the nation and healing the wounds of war began. Just as the nation was beginning to breathe a collective sigh of relief with the end of the Civil War, a shocking and tragic event occurred that would forever alter the course of American history. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln was shot by the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Lincoln was attending a performance of Our American Cousin with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and several friends when Booth entered the presidential box and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Lincoln was rushed to a nearby boarding house where doctors attempted to save him, but the wound was fatal. The president died early next morning on April 15, 1865. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a devastating blow to the nation. Lincoln had led the country through its darkest hour, guiding the Union to victory and working toward a future in which the United States could be reunited and slavery abolished. His death plunged the country into mourning and left many wondering what the future would hold without his leadership. Lincoln's assassination was part of a broader conspiracy orchestrated by Booth and his associates to cripple the Union government. The conspirators had also planned to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward, but their attempts failed. Booth fled the scene of the crime, sparking a massive manhunt that ended with his death at the hands of Union soldiers on April 26, 1865. While Booth's actions shocked the nation, they did not succeed in derailing the Union's victory or the process of Reconstruction that was just beginning. The impact of Lincoln's assassination on the nation was large. In the North, Lincoln was mourned as a martyr who had given his life for the cause of liberty and the preservation of the Union. Millions of Americans attended memorial services and processions in his honor and his funeral train, which carried his body from Washington, D.C. to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, which was met by grieving crowds along the way. For many, Lincoln's death symbolized the high cost of the war and the sacrifices made to preserve the Union. In the South, reactions to Lincoln's assassination were more complex. While some Confederate sympathizers initially celebrated Booth's actions, many Southern leaders recognized that Lincoln's death would make the process of reunification and reconciliation more difficult. Lincoln had favored a relatively lenient approach to Reconstruction, aiming to bring the Southern states back into the Union quickly and with minimal punishment. With Lincoln gone, Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, and his approach to Reconstruction would be marked by conflict and controversy. Lincoln's death left a deep and lasting scar on the nation. The man who had led the country through its greatest crisis was now gone, and the challenges of rebuilding the Union and ensuring justice for the newly freed African Americans would have to be carried out by others. The assassination also fueled bitterness and resentment in both the North and the South, complicating the already difficult task of healing the divisions caused by the war. The collapse of the Confederacy in 1865 marked the end of a long and brutal conflict that had torn the United States apart for years. The fall of Petersburg and Richmond, followed by Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ended the military resistance of the Confederacy. The final battles and skirmishes, along with the capture of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, marked the disintegration of the Southern war effort and the collapse of the Confederate government. While these events brought an end to the fighting, they also signaled the beginning of a new and challenging chapter in American history: the process of Reconstruction. The surrender of Robert E. Lee's army at the Appomattox Courthouse was a defining moment in history of the Civil War. It symbolized not only the military defeat of the Confederacy, but also the start of a period of national reconciliation. Grant's generous terms of surrender reflected a desire to heal the wounds of the war and to bring the Southern states back into the Union without excessive punishment. However, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln just days later threatened to derail these efforts. Lincoln's assassination was a national tragedy that deeply affected the Union at a time when it was poised to move forward towards Reconstruction and reunification. The president's death at the hands of John Wilkes Booth deprived the nation of a leader who had shown great wisdom, patience, and compassion during the war. Lincoln's vision for a lenient Reconstruction designed to reunite the country without harsh reprisals would now be left to his successor, Andrew Johnson, whose approach would be more divisive and controversial. The collapse of the Confederacy was not just a military defeat, it represented the end of the Southern states' attempt to break away from the Union and preserve the institution of slavery. The war's end brought freedom to millions of enslaved African Americans, but it also ushered in a long and difficult struggle for civil rights and equality. The Union's victory ensured that the United States would remain one nation, but the question of how to rebuild the South and integrate formerly enslaved people into American society remained a deeply contentious issue. The final months of the Civil War, culminating in the fall of Richmond, Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and Lincoln's assassination, were among the most dramatic and consequential in American history. The events of 1865 not only ended the bloodiest conflict that the United States had ever experienced, but also set the stage for the complex and often painful process of Reconstruction. As the nation sought to heal the divisions caused by the war, the legacy of these events would continue to shape American society for generations to come. The surrender at Appomattox, the collapse of the Confederate government, and Lincoln's assassination were all pivotal moments that defined the end of the Civil War. However, the challenges of Reconstruction, the quest for racial equality, and the task of reuniting a divided nation would remain central issues of the post-war era. As the country moved forward from the devastation of the Civil War, it would be Lincoln's legacy of perseverance, justice, and unity that would continue to guide the nation through its most difficult moments. The Reconstruction era, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, was a complex and transformative period in American history, marked by the nation's efforts to rebuild and reunite after the Civil War. During this time, the federal government faced the enormous challenge of integrating the southern states back into the Union, ensuring the rights of newly freed African Americans, and rebuilding the South's war-torn economy. Reconstruction can be divided into several phases, each characterized by different policies and approaches to addressing the lingering issues of war. The first phase, often called Presidential Reconstruction, was led by President Andrew Johnson following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln in April 1865. Johnson, a Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union during the war, pursued a lenient approach to Reconstruction, offering amnesty to most former Confederates and allowing Southern states to rejoin the Union quickly, provided that they ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. Under Johnson's plan, many Southern states passed Black Codes, laws that severely restricted the rights and freedoms of African Americans. These laws sought to maintain a social order similar to slavery, leading to outrage in the North and opposition from the Republican-controlled Congress. Congressional Republicans, led by the Radical Republicans, believed that Johnson's approach was too lenient and that stronger federal intervention was necessary to protect the rights of African Americans and ensure the South was fully transformed. In response, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts in 1867, marking the beginning of the Congressional or Radical Reconstruction. These acts divided the South into 5 military districts, placing them under the control of the Union generals and requiring Southern states to draft new constitutions, guaranteeing African American men the right to vote. The Southern states had to ratify the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all people born in the United States, including former slaves. Congressional Reconstruction was a period of intense federal involvement in the Southern affairs, with the aim of fundamentally reshaping Southern society and politics. However, these efforts faced significant resistance both from former Confederates and from newly formed white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Reconstruction was marked by achievements such as the establishment of public schools and the election of African American legislators, but it was also characterized by violent opposition and ongoing struggles over the meaning of freedom and equality. One of the most lasting legacies of the Reconstruction era was the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution, often referred to as Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments fundamentally reshaped the legal and political landscape of the United States, particularly with regard to the rights of African Americans. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery in the United States. This amendment was a monumental achievement as it formally ended the institution of slavery that had been at the heart of the Civil War. While the 13th Amendment legally freed millions of enslaved people, the question of what freedom truly meant for African Americans remained a central issue during Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment, ratified in July 1868, was a response to the Black Codes and other attempts by Southern states to limit the rights of African Americans. This amendment granted citizenship to anyone born or naturalized in the United States, including formerly enslaved individuals, and guaranteed equal protection under the law. The 14th Amendment was a major step forward in the fight for civil rights, as it provided a constitutional basis for challenging discriminatory laws and practices. It also laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements by establishing the principle that all citizens, regardless of race, should be treated equally under the law. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, sought to address the issue of voting rights by prohibiting the denial of the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment was a critical victory for African American men, many of whom had been denied the right to vote even after the Civil War. The 15th Amendment gave African American men the opportunity to participate in political process for the first time, and during Reconstruction, many African Americans were elected to local, state, and even national office. Together, these three amendments represented a significant expansion of civil rights in the United States and were intended to secure the freedoms won during the Civil War. However, the implementation of these rights was uneven, and the amendments faced significant resistance, particularly in the South, where white supremacist groups and discriminatory practices continued to undermine African American political and social rights. One of the most significant challenges to Reconstruction was the rise of white supremacist organizations, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. Founded in 1866 in Tennessee, the KKK quickly spread throughout the South using violence and intimidation to resist Reconstruction policies and suppress African American political participation. The Klan's tactics included lynching, arson, and other forms of terror aimed at African Americans and their white allies, such as Northern Republicans and Southern Unionists. The rise of the KKK and similar groups reflected the deep opposition among many Southern whites to the changes brought about by Reconstruction, particularly the enfranchisement of African Americans in the presence of federal troops in the South. The federal government responded by passing the Enforcement Acts in the early 1870s, which gave the president the authority to use federal troops to protect African American voters and to prosecute those who used violence to undermine Reconstruction. While these laws had some success in curbing Klan violence, the broader challenge of protecting African American rights in the South remained. By the mid-1870s, the political will to continue Reconstruction was waning in the North. Many Northern voters grew tired of the ongoing military presence in the South and the seemingly endless conflict over the Reconstruction policies. At the same time, Southern Democrats who opposed Reconstruction began to regain political power in the South through a combination of violence, voter suppression, and political maneuvering. The contested presidential election of 1876 between Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden would ultimately bring Reconstruction to an end. The election of 1876 was one of the most controversial in American history, with disputed results in several Southern states. To resolve this crisis, a political deal known as the Compromise of 1877 was struck. In exchange for the presidency, Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877 marked the end of federal efforts to protect African American rights in the South, and in the years that followed, Southern states enacted a series of laws that systematically disenfranchised African Americans and segregated public life. The end of Reconstruction had profound long-term impacts on the political, social, and economic landscape of the United States. Politically, the withdrawal of federal troops from the South allowed white supremacist Democrats, often referred to as redeemers, to regain control of the Southern state of governments. These governments quickly enacted Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans through poll taxes, literary tests, and other discriminatory practices. For nearly a century, these laws would limit the political and civil rights of African Americans in the South. Socially, the end of Reconstruction marked the beginning of a long period of racial violence and discrimination in the South. African Americans, though legally free, were subjected to intense racial hostility and were often denied access to education, employment, and basic civil rights. The promise of equality enshrined in the 14th and 15th Amendments remained unfulfilled for generations as African Americans faced systemic racism and oppression. Economically, the South struggled to recover from the devastation of the Civil War. The collapse of the plantation economy, combined with the lack of meaningful economic support during Reconstruction, left many African Americans in poverty. Sharecropping, a system in which formerly enslaved people worked land owned by white landlords in exchange for a portion of the crops, became widespread in the South. This system often trapped African Americans in a cycle of debt and poverty, limiting their economic opportunities and reinforcing social inequalities. In the North, Reconstruction and its aftermath also had significant political economic effects. The Republican Party, which had championed Reconstruction, lost much of its political influence in the South and became more focused on industrialization and economic growth in the North. The period after the Civil War saw the rise of large corporations, railroads, and a rapidly expanding industrial economy, which transformed the United States into a global economic power. The legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction continues to shape American society to this day. Reconstruction amendments, particularly the 14th Amendment, remain foundational to modern civil rights law. Throughout the 20th century, the courts would invoke these amendments to strike down segregation, protecting voting rights, and extend civil liberties to all Americans regardless of race. The civil rights movements in the 1950s and 60s built upon the legal framework established during Reconstruction as activists fought to make the promises of Reconstruction amendments a reality. However, the failure of Reconstruction to fully integrate African Americans into American society and protect their rights had lasting consequences. The era of Jim Crow's laws, racial violence, and economic inequality persisted for decades after the end of Reconstruction, and the fight for racial justice continues in the present day. The Civil War itself remains a defining moment in American history, one that continues to influence the nation's political, social, and cultural landscape. The war settled the question of secession and preserved the Union, but the deeper issues of racial equality and civil rights were left unresolved, leading to a century of struggle for African Americans. The memory of the Civil War and Reconstruction has also shaped American identity in complex ways. In the South, many white Southerners embraced the lost cause narrative, which romanticized the Confederacy and downplayed the centrality of slavery in the conflict. This narrative contributed to enduring racial divisions in the United States and helped justify the establishment of Jim Crow laws and segregation. In contrast, African Americans and civil rights activists have viewed Reconstruction as a period of progress, however brief, and at a time when the country made its first serious attempts to live up to the ideals of freedom and equality for all. The Civil War's legacy can be seen in modern debates over civil rights, race relations, and the role of government in protecting individual liberties. The Reconstruction amendments continue to be cited in legal battles over voting rights, affirmative action, and equal protection under the law. The Supreme Court's interpretation of these amendments has played a crucial role in shaping modern society, particularly in the context of civil rights protections. The economic and political changes brought about by the Civil War and Reconstruction also laid the groundwork for the United States' emergence as a global power in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The rapid industrialization that followed the war, coupled with the expansion of railroads and other infrastructure, transformed the American economy and helped establish the nation as a leader on the world stage. However, the uneven distribution of economic opportunities and the persistence of racial and social inequalities have remained sources of tension in American society. The legacies of slavery and segregation continue to affect African American communities as they face disparities in education, housing, employment, and the criminal justice system. The Reconstruction era, though often seen as a period of unfulfilled promises, was a crucial moment in American history that laid the foundation for the ongoing struggles, civil rights, and equality. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments represented a significant expansion of American democracy, and their impact continues to shape the legal and political landscape of the United States. Despite the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and the rise of white supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, the achievements of this era were not entirely erased. The failure of Reconstruction to fully protect the rights of African Americans and to dismantle the racist system that persisted in the South would have long-term consequences. The Compromise of 1877 marked the end of federal efforts to enforce the civil rights in the South, but it also set the stage for future struggles as African Americans and their allies continued to fight for justice and equality. The Civil War and Reconstruction left an indelible mark on American society, influencing everything from race relations to civil rights to the role of the federal government in promoting social justice. The war's legacy, both in terms of its successes and failures, continue to be felt today as the United States grapples with long-term impacts of slavery, segregation, and systematic racism. In the end, Reconstruction era was not a time of rebuilding after devastating war. It was a moment of transformation that shaped the nation and set the stage for ongoing quests to achieve the full promise of American democracy. The legacy of Reconstruction remains a powerful reminder of both the progress that has been made and the challenges that still lie ahead in the pursuit of a more just society.